Welcome to the Wade Center's podcast,
a podcast of Wheaton College. My name is David Downing.
And I'm Crystal Downing. We are the new co-directors here at the Marion E. Wade Center.
And we're excited to bring you our new podcast.
The Wade Center's podcast will feature interviews and discussions with scholars and figures related to the Wade's 7 authors.
C.S. Lewis, J.R.R. Tolkien, Dorothy L. Sayers, George MacDonald, G.K. Chesterton, Owen Barfield, and Charles Williams.
Make sure to connect with our podcast and subscribe on our website, wheaton.edu/Wade, as well as iTunes, Spotify, and even on our YouTube channel. We hope you enjoy this week's episode. Hello, this is Dr. Crystal Downing, and I'm here with my co-director of the Wade Center. And we are interviewing Patti Callahan, whose book on the relationship between C.S. Lewis and Joy Davidman has been garnering rave reviews. It is a Christian Science Monitor top books of the year, numerous awards. She is getting much attention, and we're delighted to have her here with us. So thanks for joining us, Patti.
I am so happy to be here. You know, I started my research here, and I walked in the doors today, and I just was kind of overwhelmed with tears. Now I'm going to get choked up of seeing its fruition in a place like this. And it's not really me who's getting all the attention. It's Joy. I feel like she's finally getting maybe some of the attention that was either been the wrong kind or hasn't happened at all.
Why don't you tell us what inspired your novel, where you write in the first person from Joy Davidman's perspective? What was the spark that got it going?
So I think the spark must have happened long before I became consciously aware of it. I believe as writers, you're both writers, so you know that these things kind of swirl around in the unconscious for a bit until the just right question or just right thing happens. And I was talking with a dear friend of mine about how I felt creatively at a dead end, which for a writer is a little panicky sometimes. And she, instead of giving advice, asked the just right question. And she said, what would you write about if you could write about anything you wanted? And without any thought, because my guard was down, I said, Joy Davidman. And she said, who's that? And I said, that's the problem. She's only known as wife of C.S. Lewis when she is this fascinating, fiery, courageous, interesting, award-winning poet. And I just, went off, and she said, well, why don't you write it? And I said, because it's historical fiction, and that's not what I do. And she said, well, I write historical fiction, so I'll write. I said, no, I got it. I totally got it. I'm right. We're a team. And literally from that moment on, we were a team. And as far as writing it from the first person, I decided very early on that I wanted to write from her, that I was tired of hearing about her, that I wanted to hear from her.
How did you choose your title, Becoming Mrs. Lewis?
Interesting. We had a lot of titles. As you both know, books often have a lot of titles. My original title was The Consolation of a Happy Ending. And you both probably know where that comes from. It comes from Tolkien's essay on fairy stories, where he discusses that part of the reason we love fairy stories is the consolation of a happy ending. And it really struck a chord with me because Lewis and Joy were both enamored with MacDonald and with the fairy tales of some of those writers. And it was also a little bit of poetic justice because, as is well known, Tolkien was not that kind to Joy. And so I felt it was a little poetic justice on my part, but it didn't work. It wasn't the right title. So we knew we had to use the name Mrs. Lewis. It started from there, and we played with it. It was the Chronicles of Mrs. Lewis. And I said, really, this book isn't about her becoming. This book isn't just about being Mrs. Lewis. It is about who she becomes as a woman and as a believer and as someone who starts to see her worth in something bigger. And the word becoming just seemed the right word.
Another title could have been Seduced by Joy.
Ooh. That might have got me a whole different audience.
Okay.
Well, the paperback, maybe we'll do that.
That's right. Well, I wanted to ask the question in terms of the decisions you make when you're doing historical fiction. Obviously, the main facts are known, but you have a lot of latitude in terms of conversations and the backstory. And I wanted to ask about your decisions in terms of, here I'm going to be very factual and you could read it in a biography. And here I need to make some creative interpolations to fill out the whole story emotionally. So can you talk a little bit about those choices?
Yes. I was very deliberate in this. So what I decided from the get-go was that the skeleton of the story would be built entirely of irrefutable facts. That the skeleton of, if we're going to look at this book as a person, the skeleton will be solid, built of irrefutable facts. I am talking their birth, their death, what book was published when the children were born, when you were married. Facts that cannot be moved around, messed with, or extrapolated. And I spent a long while doing that. My office looked a little bit like a beautiful mind. I had this big, long butcher block paper, and it had the timelines for both of them. In fact, on my website, the publishing house has done this beautiful timeline of both their lives and then where their lives intersect and then keep going. And that was what I had made in my office, not as pretty as theirs, to make sure that my skeleton was just right. And then I say that the skin I put on that skeleton was built of an emotional truth. And that is where we start to get into who she is. So lucky for us and fortunate for a novelist, Joy tells us her emotional truth in a lot of ways. There's numerous published letters, that have been edited and put out by the marvelous Don King. And there's poetry. And then there's, of course, that amazing stash of love sonnets that she wrote that was discovered about 5 or 6 years ago now. That was in a folder in a box in the back of a closet in Oxford. And that top of the folder said courage. And then underneath it said 45 love sonnets for C.S. Lewis. So there was not, of course, there's some supposition, but Joy really tells us her emotional truth in her letters, in her poetry, in her essays, in her decalogue about the 10 Commandments. In the essay, my favorite essay she wrote is in the front of that book, where she asks the question, if we should ever grow brave, what on earth would become of us? So I was really, she tells us what she thinks. She tells us how she feels. So on top of that skeleton of irrefutable facts, I put the emotional truth. So the clothes are where we get into some imagination and inspiration. And yet even with that, meaning letters to each other, which have supposedly all been lost, and conversations they have, even though it's imagined and those are the clothes I put on her, it's not fully imagined because we have what they said to other people. We have letters they wrote to other people. We have things they've written, lectures that they've given, both of them, recordings, especially for Lewis. So we know what they think about things. We know what they would say, for the most part, as far as we can know on this side of the grave, how they would answer a question about pain or about longing. And so I took what I knew of them, and that's the clothes I put.
One of the things that interested me as I was reading your novel is that you chose to transcribe letters from C.S. Lewis that you made up rather than just summarizing them, such as Joy said, telling someone, oh, I got this interesting letter from C.S. Lewis in which he said. Can you tell us what motivated that decision?
Absolutely. So just you describing it, right, of Joy telling, pretend her friend Ava Walsh, who was Chad Walsh's wife that she was very close to, or telling Belle Kaufman, her best friend. We're all of a sudden once removed from that experience. And when it came to Joy, I didn't want us once removed from anything. Because what was important to me was that this was her transformational journey. her internal journey was just as important to me as the external obstacles that she had to overcome. And every time you remove the reader even a little bit from that emotional journey, you're once removed and don't care as deeply. And it took me a long while to figure out how to pull that off. When I think it was at about 3 a.m, it hit me that snippets were okay of letters. I have full letters I have written, and I realized that even when I read a book, if there's a full letter, I skim it, right? And so I wanted to include these snippets in the middle of her life, because the most important thing I wanted to show was how intricately involved they both became in each other's lives. Now, this is only told from her point of view, but I would put you in the middle of a scene, then drop in a snippet of a letter. I would show how she was sharing her life with him and how he was sharing his life with her, and how that was going back and forth. And it seemed the best way to keep you in scene and in emotional contact with her without once removing you. And I do have her discussing some of the letters with both Ava and with Belle and with Bill. So I was trying to show how important this pen friendship had become to her and how much it was impacting her life.
But your method is interesting and successful in that you make it almost look like a conversation. You have Jack, Joy, it's not the long letter, and it almost could be dialogue because they tend to be fairly short exchanges. I think that was a wise creative decision on your part.
Thank you. It felt natural. But let's say this, because you're both writers and sometimes what comes across most natural on the page and what ends up working is the thing we strived the hardest for. The thing that we didn't take the first inclination of how to portray it. My first inclination was the long letters, and to just give it time to find its way, and not do it the first way we think about doing it.
Speaking of the letters and the dialogue, did you make a special point to study Lewis's favorite vocabulary and certain British phrases and try to include those to give it that flavor?
I did. I looked through some of his letters, and I picked out like the word bimble for walking, or corking good writer, things like that. So yeah, I did. I wanted to be authentic without putting the reader off by taking it too far, so you felt like you were dropping into like Dickens' time in London or something. I really wanted to have him speak the way he spoke in his letters. And, fortunately for us, we have volumes and volumes and volumes of his letters that we can read and see the cadence of his language and see the way that he answered people with a kind of vulnerability and yet wisdom at the same time. I had to pretend that I wasn't pretending to be C.S. Lewis.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right.
Yeah, I had to put that out of my head.
And I'm glad you didn't say, "Cheerio, could you listen to the wireless to get some instructions on how to fix the bonnet on my?"
Yeah, that's not how he talked.
Sometimes you see that British fiction and you just shake your head.
Did you learn anything new about C.S. Lewis in the process of writing about this relationship?
Oh, absolutely. That was one of the most unexpected parts for me, was really coming to see Jack Lewis as a human being. I've been a Lewis reader all of my life. The first book I read by Lewis was when I was about 10 years old. I read the Screwtape Letters. One should not read the Screwtape Letters when they're 10 years old.
No.
But having him come alive for me in a human way was one of the biggest bonuses of this story. And I really hope it's one of the biggest bonuses for people who are reading it. Or the second. The first is that they get to know Joy Davidman as a woman and as in her own right. But, let's go back and remember that in the late 1940s and early 1950s, when they first became friends, C.S. Lewis did not know that he was C.S. Lewis. Right. He didn't know that he was this revered man on some kind of pedestal. He would probably not like that very much.
In fact, David calls him the Elvis of evangelicals.
Yes. He probably, I don't know how we'd feel, right?
No.
About that. And so we have to remember that in this time, He was a wounded and vulnerable man who had built a really secure and safe life in a man's world of Oxford University. Oxford in the late 40s, early 50s was still very much a man's place. He was part of the Inklings. He lived with his brother. He was a confirmed old bachelor. He had a very comfortable life that he very much enjoyed. And yet he had a lot of wounds and pains. He'd lost his mother at 9 years old. He had seen one of the men he loved the most in his life killed right next to him in the war. And he was sent home only with shrapnel from what killed his friend next to him. He'd been turned down 3 times for advancement at Oxford. People don't talk about that. We talk about how he was lauded and how, people revered him, but that wasn't always true. He was just a man trying to figure out his way in the world, trying to write, trying to enjoy deep friendships. And then here comes someone like Joy Davidman, like a blast of fire into his life, and he's human. And I loved seeing him, the more I read about it and the more I understood that he wasn't quite as dapper as Anthony Hopkins might have made him seem, right? He had holes in his elbow patches and stepped down on the back of his shoes and had holes in his pockets and had cigarette ash on his clothes, and his hat was always lopsided with part of it missing. And he was human. And it was well into the writing that I was able to step back and see him maybe as she saw him. Not only as an intellectual equal with her, I'm not talking about myself, not only as an intellectual equal, but also as a man that she admired and that was fun and funny and enjoyable and liked to be out in nature and enjoyed deep discussion and liked a pint or 2 or 3. And so that was the biggest surprise for me.
I know you spent several days doing research here at the Wade Center, looking at various letters and manuscripts. What would you say was your most exciting discovery during your research here?
I never stop discovering things here. I was down in the reading room this morning going, whoa, can I go back and put that in, And I say this often in almost every lecture I give, in that coming to the Wade Center was a turning point for the novel, because once I held her unpublished papers and her unpublished letters, the ones that I couldn't easily access, once I saw the photos, once I held the papers, like her divorce decree. I read that thing. I typed that whole thing up in my computer. You can't take pictures here. And just the language in it. I had never seen that published or talked about. And I felt all of a sudden like she came alive. And I'm going to get teary-eyed talking about it. I mean, I imagined being her and in England, and she receives this divorce decree that has these claims against her in very harsh language, very cruel language. And she came alive for me in a way that could have never happened if I hadn't come to the Wade Center and sat in that reading room and opened those file boxes one by one, or signed them out. I'm not allowed to open them. I'm only allowed to sign them out one by one. So I think that the work that's done here in cataloging and keeping that legacy alive, not only for all the British authors that you keep here, but her papers, because of Lewis, are not only indispensable for understanding Lewis as a man, but also for me in writing a novel. There are, of course, biographies. But the primary source is the source. Like I said earlier, I didn't want to hear any more about her. I wanted to hear from her, and I couldn't do that unless I opened those papers and seeing the little scribbles her kids wrote in the margins of her letters, or the little notes that she wrote. There's a half-finished letter in her box. She is writing to Jack about changing a dinner date, and in it, she didn't finish the letter, and it's in the box. It was obviously never sent, and her kids drew on the leftover paper, and in it says something to the effect of, by Cats and Whiskers. I forgot I had plans that night. Can we change ours? I was like, Cats and Whiskers, that's so great. And so I used it in the book. So yeah, things like her divorce decree and her handwriting, and she came alive in a way from the work y'all have done by keeping things so cataloged, and there's more to discover. There's so much more. I could have spent 10 years.
Exciting.
No.
Did you get a chance to look at the typewriter downstairs on which she typed Till We Have Faces? Before they put it in the case, I rested my fingers on the keys.
Did you write a story instantly?
Yes, I thought there would be this magic channeling, and there was a boy named Eustace Clarendon Scrub, and he almost deserved it. But nothing happened for me. No.
Well, you should probably take it out of the case and let me try.
Actually, we should.
I'll be next.
Could you speak a little bit to the people know that A Grief Observed is largely about his experience of losing Joy, but a lot of people don't know about her creative collaboration in some of the other books, or influence in some of the earlier books. Could you mention how you wove that into the storyline?
Absolutely. I think that I know that one of the primary sparks for me wanting to tell this story, even more than when I started, was when I realized that the last 13 years of Lewis's life, 10 with her and then 3 after she passed, that his work during that time, she is rarely given credit for the muse, the best friend, the wife, the editor, and definitely the collaborator, especially Until We Have Faces. And I don't know why she's not given that credit. I don't know if it's part of the times, or, that it was the 50s. As you know, there's a scholar out of Houston, Texas named Andrew Lazo who knows much more about this than I do. But she definitely was a collaborator Until We Have Faces. And I felt that worthy of a couple chapters. So a couple chapters in the novel, we see how their friendship led to the impetus for that story and how she contributed. And you can see, once you understand their relationship a little better, once you understand the themes of her life a little better, you can see her fingerprints all over that story, about finding your true self, about taking off the veil, about myth. As we know, Till We Have Faces is a retelling of the Cupid and Psyche myth. And Lewis said that he had tried to tell it in numerous ways. He had tried a play. I think he had tried a poem. And he was with Joy one night and said that he was worried that he didn't have any more ideas, that he had moved from Oxford to Cambridge and had more free time, but no ideas. And they sat over a bottle of whiskey and brainstormed until he woke up the next morning and wrote the first chapter of Till We Have Faces.
And she performed the same service for you.
Oh, yes.
Was there whiskey involved in that moment as well?
Not as far as you know. Trying to trap me.
I don't know if this is too technical, but when you see a finished book, everything seems inevitable. Of course, the story starts here, and of course, it ends here. But when you're putting together a book, each one of those is a crossroads or a decision. So how do you say, I could see someone saying the opening scene is, I stepped off the boat in England and I was so excited, or I drove up to the kilns, but you had to decide how much backstory to get into, how much to leave out. Tell us a little bit about your creative choices in terms of the shape of the story.
We talked about this earlier, but this book, in my mind, could have easily been a trilogy. But no one wants to wait 3 books to see them get together. So I had the first chapter was many different chapters, through the years of revisions. And it's funny you mentioned the boat. That was the original first chapter for almost 2 years. I still have it. I polished that thing until it was as shiny as a star, and now it's not even in the book. But we have to make these creative choices, and for me, what happens is, as the themes become clearer and clearer, then we can bookend it, and we can understand where to start, because that will feed into where it ends. And so I don't think I'm giving away a lot when I tell you that Joy dies. And so one of the things I noticed that I hadn't seen a lot of people talk about was this theme of the lions in her life before she even met Lewis. When she was a young child, she used to sneak out in the middle of the night with her little brother Howie and feed the lions in the zoo. And
I loved that detail.
Yeah, that is
you
great.
included.
And that was real. And then when she was a screenwriter for a while in Hollywood, she helped raise the MGM lion. She was always fascinated with lions. When I was in the reading room today, I was leafing through her copy of The Problem of Pain, and she has all these annotations in the margins. And one of them says, a lion is a person. And she's referencing where he talks about wild beasts. And she is writing in the margins, a lion is a person. In her mind, they were, to her, very alive and real and personified something bigger way before she met Aslan. And so when I saw that theme and that thread, I wanted to bring that out. So the novel opens with her feeding the lions through the cage and saying, we are meant to be free, which is to me much of the theme of her life, of her trying to break free and find freedom both inside and out. And then the novel ends, of course, she dies. And I said, I used the metaphor that she heard the last great roar.
It was also the opening line of the novel, wasn't it?
Yes.
The lion.
It was the great lion who brought us
So
together.
why don't you hold that up for the listeners?
You're funny.
She was going to do it. She was going to say, here it is,
Look
folks.
how obedient she is.
Exactly.
That's funny.
Well, I'm reading Charles Williams' The Place of the Lion right
Oh,
now.
wow.
Because that is the first novel that C.S. Lewis read by Charles Williams. And as you know,
did not
they
know that.
developed a very important relationship. And you even bring in Michael Williams. Maybe you could comment on Michael Williams and why you wanted to put her in your novel.
Explain quickly who she is.
Michael Williams is the wife of Charles Williams.
Yes, that was really important for me to show for a number of incredible reasons. Number one, when Joy first went to London, it was the first person, besides the woman she stayed with, it was the first person that she went and knocked on their door and said, hi, because Joy was so shy, and said, hi, I'm Joy, I'm here, like essentially. And so Michael Williams was the widow at that time of Charles Williams, who was an Inkling. And was quite dear friends with Lewis also. And their friendship was very nourishing and very important to Joy as a newcomer in a city she didn't know. And their friendship lasted a long while. And what is fascinating is that Joy's husband, Bill Gresham, who was a very well-known writer in New York and in the United States, had written the foreword for Charles Williams' book, The Greater Trumps. So there was this odd, it's not even a triangle, it's like a trapezoid of relationships that were all these little strings that I hadn't seen brought together, which is hard to do in biography or in fact, but you can bring out in narrative form.
That's a great idea for your next novel would be a love trapezoid.
I love trapezoid.
That's a good
Are you going to pick all the people that should be in the love trapezoid?
That's right.
Another
Do they have to all be Inklings? There are only a few of them.
I was thinking about something you were saying earlier about how people have overlooked Joy Davidman except for the anguish that her death caused Lewis. And I find a similar problem since I write about Dorothy Sayers, who Lewis himself identified as one of the foremost important influences on his spiritual life. And yet I run into people at conferences who love Lewis, have read everything about Lewis, and they've never heard of Dorothy Sayers. And
isn't that cuckoo?
Yeah, cuckoo, yeah.
That's coconuts. That's bananas.
Yeah.
It's all the things. I don't know. I talk a lot about this when I'm out and about, talking about this book and why is Joy portrayed as the dying wife of C.S. Lewis, and why is Dorothy Sayers portrayed as a mystery writer when she had the greatest influence on Lewis's spiritual life than any woman?
Yes.
I don't know the answer, but I do know that one of the things that I've been saying is that I know I want us to stop talking about the woman behind the man.
Mm-hmm.
Can we please stop
Yes.
already and start
Yes.
talking about the woman beside the man? And people like Dorothy and Joy, for different reasons, were the woman beside him.
Yes.
He respected them. He loved them. He looked to them for guidance. They weren't someone fun for him to hang out with. He looked to both of them for guidance in different ways and for different things.
Mm-hmm.
So
It's a great
they were
metaphor.
beside him.
Excuse me. I was going to say that's a great metaphor for Lewis, because he says that lovers often look into each other's eyes and into each other's faces, but friends stand shoulder to shoulder, and they're both looking at the same thing, whether it's nature or literature or spirituality. And I think what's so fascinating about Joy is that she could be such a good friend and be his lover in later years.
You gave me chills. I think, and I will give credit where it's due for sure. And I think Andrew Lazo is the first person who said to me that when he lost her, he lost all four loves in one fell swoop. That she was probably the only person in his life that had fulfilled all four of the loves that he writes about. Their intellectual friendship began with letters, and then their spiritual friendship began with debate about philosophy and theology and faith and doubt and longing. And then there was a deep kinship where they were shoulder to shoulder looking out. Lewis has that great quote about, I'm going to muck this up, but when you found a friend when you say me too.
Right.
You too, us also. And I think that he had that. And then, of course, they fell into Eros. So there was all four loves there.
He also lost the greatest ever Scrabble partner.
Who plays Scrabble in all the languages?
I know.
I mean, that's crazy. I want to meet the couple that plays Scrabble in all the languages.
Wasn't one of them Hebrew? She talks about Imeth in Smoke on the Mountain, and then Imeth is the character in the last battle. But I can't remember if they overlapped enough that character.
They did. The last battle was written during the time they were together. That was and I don't know if this is why, but the queen in the last battle is Helen. Her name was Helen, Joy Davidman.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, Frank's wife becomes the queen.
Yeah, her name is Helen.
And they had a cat at some point named Ginger, but Ginger's the villain. That's the way I feel about all cats, so I have no problem with that.
You had mentioned...
You're so endearing, David.
You had mentioned seeing the little markings by Joy's sons when you were looking at unpublished letters. So I want to talk about Joy's grown son now, Douglas Gresham, who is the one who gave us the typewriter, his mother's typewriter, upon which she typed the Till We Have Faces. Has he responded to your novel? How does he feel about it?
So I'm going to start with him responding to, before I even finish the novel, how we finally crossed paths. I was quite frightened of contacting Douglas. I knew that this novel would need his permission. And I knew that I had written the novel with great respect and admiration for his mother, but I also knew that he has the say. I don't care if you have a school play in Greenville, South Carolina, or a movie, Douglas and the C.S. Lewis Company must offer permission. And I'd kind of played Scarlett O'Hara. I'll think about that tomorrow.
Yeah.
And I was at the Wade Center, and my name is on almost every folder of his mother's at this point. And I think he started asking, and Elaine, who helps run the research center, told him about me. And so I received an email from him that was unexpected.
Oh, wow, out of the blue.
Out
I
of the
didn't realize
blue.
that. Wow.
And it said, "Hello, Patti. My name is Douglas Gresham, and I hear you've been asking after my mother. May I help you?" I was a little nervous. So I emailed my agent. I said, "What do I do?" The novel was done at this point. It was about to go out on submission. And she said, "Tell him the truth." So I thought, well, that's a novel idea. So I wrote him back and I said, "My name is Patti Callahan. My full name is Patti Callahan Henry. And I've written a novel. I'm a novelist, and I've written a novel about your mother. And I've written it because I admire her. And I've written it because I want a new generation of women to meet her. I think she has something to say to us. And I've written about her because I want to bring her out from the shadowlands of this reputation as wife of. And I've written about her because she's fascinating. And then I waited, and I forget his exact response, but it was something to the effect of bravo. And then we emailed back and forth, and then we talked on the telephone. And then I realized, I mean, as we all know, Douglas lives in Malta. It's not, you just can't go visit Douglas. Well, you could, but you'd have to sell your car. So he was in the United States doing some lectures, and I knew that because he had been at the Wade Center. So I asked him where he was at that moment, and he said, I'm in Asheville doing some lectures at a college. And I said, okay, I'm in Spartanburg, South Carolina right now speaking at a library. Do not move. And he didn't. And so I went and spent the day with him and just talked and listened to stories. And he's been incredibly kind and supportive about the novel in ways that I was too scared to dream of. I was doing it anyway, but to have the support was really important to me. Every chapter starts with a snippet of her poetry, and her words come out of her mouth, and Lewis's words come out of his mouth, and I needed permission for that. And I could have taken all of that out, but the novel wouldn't have been as rich as it is without it. So to have his support has been invaluable.
He had some news stories I hadn't heard. We interviewed him a few months ago when he was here at the Wade, and one had to do with, it was a winter's day, and he wanted to show off his Christmas kayak or his canoe, and Lewis didn't want to get into it, but he wanted, for Doug's sake, to be supportive of his new venture. And so it was just interesting that Lewis would be willing to climb into a canoe in winter to make Doug feel proud of his new acquisition. He had another story about...
I love that story.
Yeah, isn't that...
See, that's what I'm talking about seeing Lewis as human. Here's this man, right? He doesn't want to get in this canoe. He's in his... It's freezing cold if it tips over. Yeah, it's amazing.
Yeah. Well, the other one was Lewis decided to bathe, and he had one of these singlets that went back to like 1915, and he didn't spend a lot of time in the weight room.
No.
So some teenage girls were coming along through the woods, and they saw him bathing, and they were making fun of him, or swimming. And Doug had a slingshot, and Joy said, go ahead and fire a rock over their head, sort of a warning shot over the bow. And so he fired a rock at them, and they took off real quickly. I thought that was a very endearing story.
Stories.
Yeah.
I love these stories. The more you hear about them, I need to listen to that interview with Doug. But the more you hear about them, the more human they are, the more alive they are. They're not just these icons on paper that we've turned into these myths that aren't real. And we're never going to get it all the way right on this side of the grave. But we can also kind of burst through the mythology of perfection or imperfection, for that matter, and try as hard as we can to look at both sides of it.
Something else surprising about your novel, and it came up in this interview, you say, she was so shy, she had trouble talking to someone. And earlier you said she had the word courage, and if we were only brave, what could we accomplish, or what would we become? Most people, that's not their image of Joy. They hear stories about she was so self-confident, and where in this monastic place can you find a women's room, that sort of comment. So they would be surprised to hear those adjectives applied to Joy. Could you fill that out a little bit more?
I think I was kidding when I said she was shy.
Oh, okay.
I was being a little sly there, sleight of hand there. I don't think she was shy, but I don't think she was comfortable in crowds. She didn't like big parties. She didn't like big gatherings, but she loved to assert herself in one-on-one conversation. There's a letter or there's a description. I need to go back and look at my notes that describes what at a party she said, she wrote a letter that Bill was always the one playing the guitar and charming people and talking, and she was always the one in the corner debating something with somebody in the corner. So it wasn't that she was shy, but she didn't like big, large gatherings. She liked that one-on-one discussion. Joy was not one to suffer fools,
right,
and she was not one to hold her tongue. But I also think that hid a really soft vulnerability and fear of showing her true self. So in my not as humble opinion, a lot of that, what they would call in the 1940s and 50s brash, what I would call audacious and interesting.
Mm-hmm.
What's with the name calling? That would be that persona she had of, well, I don't think that's true, or explain that, or, where in this monastic place can a woman find a bathroom? I think that covered up a real vulnerability and woundedness from growing up in a family that had expected perfection from her, and from a marriage where she had been in many ways diminished and demeaned. Not because her husband was a terrible person, but because the marriage was crumbling and things were, I don't want to give too much away, but things were not good. And I just feel that she was very wounded and had a lot of insecurity and was constantly trying to prove herself. And in proving herself, she came across very direct.
You see that fairly often. A surface bravado hides an underlying vulnerability. They almost need the hard shell because they know
everything's so soft in there.
Yeah.
And let's also, I always say we have to put things in context. And she grew up in the 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s in New York City. She was born in a part of New York called the Jewish Ghetto. And then she grew up in the Bronx, which was considered moving up, with her family, her mom and dad were Middle European immigrants. And so New York had a much different mentality and way of being in the world than, let's say, Oxford. So,
and she was American, and we all know how pushy they are. So
yeah,
that's
those Americans.
another factor. Well, why do you think those words brave and the word courage on the front, what was going through her mind when she used those kind of words?
I really believe that what those meant for her were breaking free. I think that Joy was always told who and how to be. I think that she had, including herself, she had high expectations of herself. She was incredibly brilliant. She was incredibly intellectual. She relied on logic until she had the experience that she had that changed her life. And I think that when she says, if we should ever grow brave, what on earth would become of us? And by putting courage on the front of that folder, I think what she was trying to tell us is that you can be as smart and logical and assertive and audacious as you please, but when it comes to showing your true self, that's what brave is.
I don't know if this is too much inside baseball, but I'm fascinated first that Jack fell in love with Joy. You wouldn't think that would be a match on eHarmony, but I'm equally
Oh my gosh, that is such a great point. What if they had filled out their boxes?
Exactly.
Ex-communist, ex-atheist, Reformed Jew, married, 2 kids, Oxford Don, tutor of English literature, never left England or Ireland except for the war. I don't think that they would have. I don't think it would have been a match.
Yeah. Well, I wanted to bring up the fact that not only Jack adored her, but also Warren. Now, he had a lot of problems with Mrs. Moore, and he felt a competition over Jack with Mrs. Moore. Now, she passed away in 1951, which I wonder if that left the emotional space for Jack to fall in love with someone like Joy. But it's fascinating to me that Warren, he loved her as much as Jack did in a different way, but it very much as a sister. What do you think? What were her traits that made these two brothers
so enamored of her? Well, that's a great question, and I'm enamored with her after spending all these years with her. So I can answer as my best guess, but part of it is her absolute curiosity about life. She was just a seeker above all the things. She was always asking the big questions, always wanting to talk about the bigger things. And Joy and Jack and Warnie were, they were part of the Inklings. They too wanted to talk about the bigger things all the time. They loved deep conversation. They loved that kind of thing. And I think that Joy endeared Warnie to her very quickly because they both had a great love of history. Joy had written her thesis, her master's thesis about Lord Orrery. I might be saying that wrong. And Warnie wrote about that time period. And they had a great love of King Charles III and that time period. And they talked a lot about it. They were going to work on a book together. She helped him appendix his book on that time period in history. And they all found like-minded friendships with each other. And it is said that Warren's journal there is a note in his journal after Joy's first letter that says, "We have just received a letter from the most fascinating American woman." So they were enchanted by her from the get-go.
We talked about her influence on Jack's books, but you wonder how many of Warren's books were published because of her camaraderie, assistance, expertise. She also watered down his booze, so I think it kept him a little bit
She
more.
did do that. She tried to get him to go to AA. And Warren, he was an alcoholic, but it was different than her husband, who had also been an alcoholic, and that Warren was a binge alcoholic. So he would be fine for long periods and then go on binges, where her husband was a, all the time drinker when he was drinking. There were periods he was sober, but Warren loved her greatly. It is said that when she passed, he couldn't be there for Jack because his grief was so great. He went on a bender and couldn't even be there for Jack when she passed away. But that's a great question. Really good point, David. I wonder how much influence she had over his work. We know she typed his work. We know she helped him do the appendix. We know that they talked about writing a book together. Which, brings us to thinking how many more works would be in the world if she hadn't died so young. People forget because they look at the pictures that she was as young as she was. But the pictures towards the end of her life, which sadly are the pictures we all usually see if you look them up, she looks way beyond her years. She was only 45 when she passed away. And because of how ill she'd been, her pictures make her look much older.
Which is ironic because that's about the same age at which his mother died when he was 9. So he had to go through the whole thing
twice
again.
It was like PTSD of the cancer. And I think it's in Grief Observed where he says, "Cancer, cancer, cancer. My mother, my father, my wife. Will there be any more? How many more?" I think is.
Well, back to your book. Sometimes you have a benchmark for yourself of what I want to accomplish in this book. And it's always nice to get awards and to be listed 5-star reviews. Do you have in your mind a benchmark that someone would say something that you would say, I've achieved my purpose in this project? Is there something that would give you creative closure in terms of?
I was really hoping the Wade Center would invite me to come talk.
Yay! You achieved your
There you go.
# goals achieved. That's a great question. I mean, honestly, it's an absolute thrill and honor to be here, and I've been looking forward to it more than any of my events because the book wouldn't be what it is without the Wade Center. So to present it here is a huge honor and a lot intimidating. But I think that my benchmark for me had more to do with joy, that I felt like I had done her proud. It's kind of odd to talk about someone who's passed, to be proud of you, but to honor her legacy, it would probably be a better way to put it, that I would introduce her to a new generation of women because I believe she has a lot to say to us. I was emailing with Douglas last week and I was telling him how many of the bookstores have been bringing her books to my events, and people have been gobbling them up and buying them, and the bookstores have been like, "Oh, we should have brought more." Smoke on the Mountain and the compilations of her letters and her poetry that Don King has put together, A Naked Tree, the other books of poetry. And people have been buying them, or when they're done my novel, they go back and they're rereading Till We Have Faces, or they're rereading The Four Loves, or rereading A Grief Observed. And that for me is a benchmark in that I wanted her legacy to continue in a positive way. I wanted her no longer to be the dying wife of C.S. Lewis, who spurred only A Grief Observed. And I think that, the book's only been out 10 weeks right now, and I believe that that is happening. People are talking about Joy in a different way, and people who have never heard of her are now hearing of her, or people who had thought of her only as the movie The Woman in Shadowlands are now discovering her as this interesting, vivacious, beautiful poet and seeing her in a new light. So I was emailing with Douglas and he made a comment. He said, "I do believe that trying to think of the word he used, but she was in the forefront of, she was ahead of her time as women stepping out beyond the expected, for what that time was. And she's even an example today. We might have come, really far in 70 years, but probably not far enough. And I often say that we might not need to pack up our kids and get on a ship and move to England, although that sounds really good. But we might need to pack up everybody's expectations of us and society's demands of us, and everybody telling us who and what we should be. And for all of Joy's life, she was told who and how to be. As a child, it earned her a lot of punishment and slaps across the face. And as a wife, it allowed her to tolerate, some things we would prefer she hadn't, and till she didn't. And so I think that she has a lot to say.
Well, I just want to close by thanking you for this interview and for the events that we're looking forward to later today here at the Wade.
Oh, we have more?
I'm out of here. I'm flying out.
I know, I gotta
go. I do think the novel fills an important emotional gap because people fast forward to the grieving experience and her illness, and we've never really seen how did they meet, how did they fall in love, what did they talk about, why did they energize each other in all these 4 ways you mentioned. So thank you for filling that gap. I mentioned earlier that people asked Eudora Welty why she wrote. She'd have people in my head that say, tell my story, tell my story. And I feel that Joy was saying, tell my story, and that you did so, and you did so successfully and eloquently. So thank you so much for being with us, but also for this really fascinating project of yours.
Thank you. No, thank you. I'm honored.